No, the value of human life changes depending on the color of the victim. Because when white South Africans cries out, the world hears an emergency. But when blacks Africans are beaten, deported or killed, suddenly the champion of the human rights becomes strangely silent. Look carefully at what is happening right now, because this is not just about South Africa anymore. This is about selective outrage. This is who or who the world tries to protect and who the world chooses to ignore. For years, Donald Trump, the president of America, has spoken passionately about what he called the persecution of white South Africans. Initially, he condemned the violence. He talked about the land seizure. He talked about farmers being targeted. He even elevated the issues into the global political stage, forcing world media to pay attention. And whether people agree with him or not, one thing is clear. He wanted the world to believe that he stood for the people he considered marginalized. Now, something else is happening inside South Africa. Black African migrants, like many people from many Africans from Zimbabwe, Nigeria, Mozambique, Malawi, and other African nations have faced deportation. They have faced attack. They have faced discrimination. They have faced mob violence, and in some cases, they face death. We have seen horrifying scenes before: shops burned, foreign owned business looted, people hunted because of their accent, man beaten in street because they were not South African enough, families displaced overnight, Africans against Africans, blacks against blacks, and suddenly the loud voice that once claimed to defend the oppressed become almost impossible to hear. Some people are beginning to ask a dangerous question: does global sympathy only activate when the victim fits a certain narrative? Because if the principle is truly about protecting vulnerable people, then why does that protection appears to be selective? Why is there no passionate speech now? Why no emergency meeting? Why no international outrage led by the same politicians who previously spoke so boldly? And this is where the conversation becomes uncomfortable, because many Africans are starting to realize that international politics has never really been driven by morality alone. It has been driven by interests, by optics, and by narratives that are politically useful. So when white South Africans were discussed, the story becomes global overnight. Western media debated it endlessly. Politicians condemned it, commented publicly. Analysts wrote reports. Social media exploded with concerns. But when black Africans suffers at that hand of the fellow Africans, the energy just changes. The cameras disappear, the speeches disappear, the urgency disappears. And some would argue that this silence exposes something deeper, but how Africans' suffering is viewed globally. Because if African lives carries equal geopolitical weight, then violence against black migrants in South Africa will not be treated like a regional inconveniences. It will be treated like a humanitarian crisis. Now, to be fair, South Africans' tensions are complicated. Many South Africans are frustrated by unemployment, poverty, crime, economic inequality, and they failed governance. Some citizens believed undocumented migrants put pressure on jobs and public service. That's very, very understandable. But frustration can never justify violence. Economic hardship can never justify dehumanizing another African. And that is exactly why many people expected influential global leaders, especially those who claim to speak for forgotten and marginalized, to condemn these attacks consistently, regardless of race, because principles only matters when they apply universal. So if you speak loudly for one group but stay silent for another group facing violence, people will question whether your position was about justice in the first place. And this is not only about Donald Trump. This criticism can be extended to much of international communities. African lives often becomes visible only when their suffering serves as a large political narrative. This is the painful truth many young Africans are waking up to. Because when conflict erupts in Africa, which only involves black victims, the global response is often slow, sometimes quieter and less emotionally charged. And many Africans are asking, if the world truly believes all human lives matters equally, why does African pen so often struggle to condemn equal outrage? Why is the language of the human rights sometimes is so selective? Why do some victims become headlines while others become statistics? And perhaps the most uncomfortable question of all these questions is, if black Africans cannot even receive consistent global solidarity when they suffer, then who exactly is standing for them when the world, who is really standing for them at the world stage? That's the question we ought to ask ourselves. And this is where the contradiction becomes even harder to ignore. Because the same Donald Trump who publicly elevated concerns about white South Africans once went as far engaging directly with South African leadership over those issues. The issues mattered enough to reach the level of diplomacy, important enough for statement, important enough for meetings, important enough for international attention. And that is exactly why many people are now talking about, if this suffering of white South Africans deserve direct political engagement, then why does the suffering of black African migrants inside South Africa does not deserve that same urgency? Why no high level pressure now? Why no public condemnation now? Why no invitation focus on the safety of black Africans being attacked, displaced or deported? Because if human rights are truly universal, then concern should not depend on race, political faithfulness or media value. This is why so many critics argues that we are witnessing what we are witnessing is not just silence but selective empathy. Think about the message this sends to Africans watching across the continent. Because when white South Africans were presented as victims, some of the world's most powerful voices reacted immediately. The issue became part of international political discourse. It was discussed with with seriousness and emotion. But when black Africans are targeted during xenophobic violence, when immigrants from Zimbabwe are hunted in the streets, when Nigerians were attacked, when Zimbabweans are blamed for economic hardship, when African immigrants are deported in humiliating conditions, the reaction from these global leaders becomes noticeably weak. And that silence creates perception, a dangerous perception, that some lives triggers diplomacy while others triggers indifference. Now, supporters of Donald Trump would argue that his focus has always been tied to issues he believes affected Americans' interests directly. Others may say he was responding to specific claims involving land reforms, property rights, and international concerns surrounding white farmers. But critics respond with another question. If morality only appears when there is political value attached to it, then can it truly be called morality at all? Because leadership is tested when defending people who bring no political advantage. And this is the heart of frustration many Africans feels. To them, it appears as though black African suffering rarely becomes urgent unless it can be connected to Western strategic interest or ideological battle or emotional powerful narratives that resonate internationally. That is why many Africans have become deeply skeptical of global political language. They hear speeches about democracy. They hear speeches about freedom. They hear speeches about justice and humanity. But when they look at situation like this, Africans suffering in South Africa, and they ask, where are those same voices now? Where is the emergency concern? Where is the outrage? Because if a global leader could publicly involve himself in one racial conflict inside South Africa, then surely people expect at least some acknowledgement when another vulnerable group is facing violence and hostility. Unless, of course, there is simple no political interest in it. And that possibility is what fuels the anger. Because many Africans are beginning to believe that international compensation often follows visibility, influence, and strategic usefulness, not necessarily fairness. And if that is true, then it means Africa may have misunderstood the nature of global politics for decades. It means many African people believe the world would defend them based on principles, when in reality, nations often act based on interest. And nowhere does that contradiction appears more clearly than in the silence surrounding black on black violence in South Africa. Because the uncomfortable reality is this: if victims were different, would the world already be holding emergency discussions? Would headlines dominate international media for weeks? Would powerful politicians be demanding accountability? Would diplomatic pressure already be mounted? Those are the questions many Africans are now asking. And the fact that those questions even exist shows how deeply trust in global moral consistency has started to erode. And why many Africans are questioning the silence of powerful Western leaders like Donald Trump. Another question is now rising from across the continent itself. Where exactly are the African institutions that supposedly created for moments like this? Like, where is the urgency from ECOWAS? Where is the strong coordination response from the African Union? Because this is not a small misunderstanding between neighbors. This involves African migrants, African workers, African families, African lives, and if Africans organization cannot rapidly respond when Africans are under threat inside another African country, then many people are beginning to ask a brutal question. What exactly are these organizations truly for? Because ordinary Africans, we are told these blocks exist to promote unity, to protect regional stability, to protect African citizens, to encourage cooperations among national nations, to prevent conflict before it explodes. That was the promise. The dream of Pan-Africanism, the idea that Africans will stand together as one people instead of their divided colonial territories, constantly suspicious of one another. But when moments of crisis appears, many Africans say these institutions suddenly becomes painfully slow, overly diplomatic, and almost invisible. Statements are released, meetings are announced, committees are formed, but the people suffering on the ground often sees little immediate actions. And this frustration is growing, especially among youngsters, among young Africans who no longer judge institutions by speeches, but by results. Because what is the purpose of continental unity if Africa still feels abandoned when violence erupts? What is the purpose of a regional bloc if citizens from member nations can be attacked while leaders respond with hesitation? What is the purpose of endless summits, expensive conference, diplomatic handshake, and the symbolic speeches if ordinary Africans still feels unprotected across the continent? These are uncomfortable questions, but they are becoming impossible to ignore. Many critics argues that organizations like the African Union often struggle because they are built around diplomacy first and decisive actions second. Too many compiling political interests, too many governments protecting each other from criticism, too much fear of interfering in internal affairs. And because of that, urgent crises can become trapped inside endless political cautions. Meanwhile, the people affected continue suffering. And this is where many Africans becomes delusioned because they compare Africa's institutions to how aggressively other regions defend their own interests. When major instability threatens powerful regions of the world, response can be swift, pressure mounted quickly, emergency meetings happen immediately, sanctions are discussed, strong public statements dominate headlines ASAP. But in Africa, there are often the feeling that leaders spend more time managing appearance when solving problems. And that perception damages trust, especially among Africans who already feels disconnected from political elites. Too many of them, the African Union sounds powerful on paper but weak in moment that requires bold moral leadership. And the same criticism is increasingly directed as an economic community of Western African states. Because if ECOWAS can move rapidly when political power is threatened, if it can organize emergency summits over coups and a constitutional crisis, then people naturally ask why the protection of African civilians across borders often appear less urgent. Why does political instability sometimes receive faster actions than human suffering? Why does diplomacy move quickly for governments but slowly for ordinary people? And perhaps the most painful part of all is what they reveal about African unfinished unity. Because despite decades of speeches about African brotherhood, xenophobia still exists. It still exists. Africa still disbursed fellow Africans from neighboring countries. Economic hardship still turns migrants to scapegoats. Colonial borders still psychologically divide people who we are supposed to move towards continental unity. And until Africans confront those realities, honestly, organizations like the African Union and ECOWAS will continue facing criticism from citizens who feel their institutions are disconnected from the real African pain. Because unity is not about proving slogan. It is about proving it is proven during crisis. It is proven when vulnerable people need attention. It is proven when leaders whose courage who choose courage over silence. And right now, many Africans are looking at both the international community and the African institutions themselves and asking the same haunting question. If Africans cannot rely fully on world and cannot rely fully on their own continental institution either, then who will truly stand for Africans? Who will truly stand for African people when it matters the most? This is the most fearful question Africans begin to ask themselves. So if this is your first time of coming across my videos, please do well to like, subscribe, and comment on this video. Let's engage in the comment section because this is a continental problem which needs a political discussion like this